unique, and I am going to start recording now, is we kind of come from a similar background as many of you. So years ago, we served on the volunteer review committee for awards, grants, scholarships, all of the above. Way back in time, these programs are done through paper, believe it or not. So we'd have hundreds of binders mailed to our doorstep. We're tasked with handwriting notes and feedback and scores. We meet with other committee members, at conferences or on the weekends. And we hash out the details when we made selections. Over time, though, most of you have kind of pivoted to using technology in a good way. You're using your AMSs, you're using emails, you're using spreadsheets, you have a lot of downloading of documents, you're using Google Drive folders, a wide variety of tools. And unfortunately, all that did is kind of duplicate the work that was happening with paper. The only difference is instead of, building out manual nomination packets, we're not building out virtual nomination packets. So the legwork that goes into it's the same. The downside of that, though, is as a volunteer, instead of having like binders all stored and sent to us, now we're going to one tool, we're downloading, we're going to a spreadsheet, we're logging our notes, we're sending it back and forth. And a couple of very problematic things started happening. So number one is we started to see a decrease in participation. Number two is it led to very bias in our selections. We saw who the applicants were, we saw demographic details, and it's quite unfortunate, but it did lead to biased reviews. And then people got lost. So you get phone calls like 6 months later from nominees or from scholars saying, "Hey, what's the status of my entry?" And we're left saying, like, we don't even know who you are. We never reviewed your stuff. And it turns out it is because we lost it with all the downloading and exporting. So fast forwarding out to 2025, Reviewer works with thousands of these programs, very heavily working with membership base and foundations to kind of streamline the operations from start to finish. And so again, today we're going to very heavily focus on the award side of things. I will start first and foremost, kind of talking a bit more about like award design and structure. I think that we have broad membership bases, and a lot of times we focus on very niche or narrow award categories, where a large percentage of your membership doesn't even have like a place to participate, right? Or they don't feel like they do. So how do we kind of create these inclusive award categories that no matter what type of member you are, there's some type of way for you guys to participate? We're then going to move into, I think, the most insightful component here today, which is like, how do you actually structure your nomination process? I think historically speaking, most associations have a very one-dimensional nomination form that's either a self-application or nominating by the peers. And when it's a peer nomination, you're losing a lot of valuable content from the nominee. And if you're putting the work on the nominator, it kind of makes a pretty high effort for them to submit their content. So how do we break this into two parallel components? One that's purely from a marketing perspective to like increase participation. And then the other component is to get highly valuable, accurate information from the nominees themselves, which kind of a bonus tip there does increase their member engagement scores by almost 2x. And then the third piece we're going to talk about is how do we eliminate volunteer fatigue? Again, they're the lifeblood of our associations. How do we kind of engage them, keep them hyper-focused, not overwhelm them, yet again, like I mentioned, keep them so they can provide enough energy to the applicants that they deserve. And then we'll kind of get into like some ongoing like reporting capabilities as well. So with all that said, everything that we have pulled up here is purely for conversational purposes. We will send this back out. I am going to kind of walk through Reviewer, not necessarily to demo the system, although you certainly will get a behind the scenes look. But I'm a very visual person, so I want to visualize these concepts for you guys. So with that said, let's start with the strategic award categories. So I think for many of you, and you can kind of raise a show of hands, like where your focus lies. We have a big challenge ahead of us, and that is the demographic of who our membership is. Targeting a younger, newer demographic of membership is essential to the long-term sustainability of your association. So from like an award perspective, offering like a 30 under 40 or a new member of the year type of award structure is the lowest hanging, most obvious category that all of you should be starting to incorporate. Now, again, when you've got multiple different awards in multiple different categories, the type of content you're going to be collecting from nominators and nominees has to be very unique. So I can kind of walk you through like how you can kind of structure that. But the ideation behind here is I want you to kind of holistically look at your membership base and kind of start to segment out and figure out like, do we currently have an award category that they can participate in? And if not, we'll start to spin them up. So that way, no matter who you are as a member, when you go to look at the nomination forms, you have a place. So for me, I like to focus on kind of four key buckets. Again, number one is early stage or career stage categories. So 30 under 30, new member of the year. And then also the latter end of that, which would be like your lifetime achievement, or some of those that have been around for a long time. There's other reasons why we like to focus on that demographic, which we'll get into down the road, which is like mentorship. They can be content writers on your website. So again, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but all these award categories are strategically aligned to also help you guys capture content and resources that fulfill some of the content resources that you want to push out to your membership. The next one's gonna be very function based. So like mentorship of the year, community impact, DEI related stuff, chapter based elements, and then innovation and growth, right? So all of you guys have a demographic of membership. They're all facing similar challenges as you as an association. Like your primary focus here is obviously advocacy and also helping align resources that provide value to your members. And so, what better type of award category do you kind of pose challenges to them that are industry specific that they're all facing? Let them demonstrate how they're solving it, and then honor them. And then again, those become like blog posts or podcast hosts for future webinars that you guys host to help your broader membership base solve those same challenges that they did. So I'm not going to get too much deeper into this. I will visualize it for you. What I really want to focus on, though, for probably the next 10 or 15 minutes is like, what does the modern nomination structure look like? So, raise of hands, and I'm kind of curious, and there's a large number of people here, so I'm not sure if I can see everybody react here with an emoji or toss it into chat. How many of you guys actually incorporate the nominees into your award application structure? So what I mean by that is the person who's actually nominated is the one that submits the bulk of the content. And I am kind of curious. So the reason why I bring that up is nomination forms themselves take time and effort to fill out. I know it's a very obvious statement. However, if you are nominating other people for the award, they're basically volunteering their time to do so. And so in order for them to kind of sit down and do this in one sitting, like you can't physically ask them to submit comprehensive bios about the nominees. You can't ask them to submit things like resumes because they don't have it. And you can't really ask them to write long, complex content about them because they're just not going to put forth a ton of time and energy. They want to participate. They want to throw somebody else's name in the hat to recognize them, but they don't want to put in the time. And that's understandable, right? Like this is just something that they're doing out of the kindness of their heart. With that said, you need that volume to come in. And so, how do we kind of structure a nomination process that you completely lower the barrier? I'm talking like 3 to 5 minutes tops, right? Where you can kind of submit nominations and then put the bulk of the effort and energy on the nominee. They're the ones who come in and submit like their career achievements. They're answering your essay prompts. They're adding like their resumes. They're updating their records, right? So their contact information, their current jobs, all these types of things that you guys essentially will need from them. So what does that look like? So the idea is to actually split your nomination structure into two parts. Part number one is a very simple nomination form. And again, I don't want to get too deep into what's on my page. I do want to show this to you. And it's literally as simple as saying, hey, who are you? Who are you nominating? Why? And then maybe what award category is this for? And then from there, leveraging triggers that actually notify the nominees that they've been nominated. And then they come in and do the detailed applications. They're the ones that do all the bulk of the content. The reason why this is good, again, is a higher quality entrance. But more importantly, is we have very clear insights here at Reviewer that just being nominated by your peers increases their member engagement scores by almost 2 times. So I'm not necessarily saying those that receive an award or are recognized. I'm talking about just those that got that email that said, hey, so and so, you were nominated for this year's XYZ category. They have a higher chance of participation, and just that peer recognition alone makes them more likely to attend conferences. They're more likely to attend like your roundtables and all these other initiatives that you're doing. So their member engagement score goes up, and vice versa. Your non-member dues from that particular member also start to go up as well. So many, many benefits behind this. Now, in practice, it's quite challenging, right? Because now you have two siloed data points. You've got all these nominations coming in, you have all these applications coming in. How do you start to merge them together? When you go to do a review, what are you actually reviewing content off of? So that's kind of where I want to shift focus, and I want to look at a very simple example. This example is simple by design. I want to just visualize that you can make these award nominations very, very impactful, but also very short from both applicant and the nominator side of things. So most of our clients from a marketing perspective will continue to use their websites, which makes total sense. Your membership is going to go there first anyways. You guys have complete content, images control, branding control. So we want to leverage that environment. What they do is when the nominations open, they have a link that says, click here to apply. And that is what transitions them to reviewer. So this is a real example. With that said, I'm going to offer a couple other insights here, I think, as far as like a best practice perspective goes. For those of you that only offer the awards to your membership, this is where your AMS comes into play. So doing things like single sign-on with your AMS is a very obvious thing to do. As you guys know, AMSs don't have like full-on award management structure. They have submission forms, right, which you can use, but then you lose all the operational tools as well as like the review and selection side. So many AMSs work alongside a reviewer as a partner to provide more value to you guys. So I would imagine the vast majority of the AMSs that you guys currently work with, we integrate with. And I will also kind of just throw a quick note that if you guys have any questions or comments, toss them into the chat. I'll address them as we go, as well as at the end. Nominators come in. The first thing I want to do there is I want to ask them, hey, is this a self-nomination or are you nominating one of your peers? Because that answer kind of dictates their workflow. If they are nominating their peer, they just fill out what's in front of them. If it's a self-nomination, they kind of bypass this and they fill out a different form, which would be the exact same one as if they were nominated by somebody else. I also like to do some vetting questions as well. So typically we put this on the nominator, or sorry, the nominee side. But if you have like very clear eligibility requirements, let's put them out there and have the nominator answer those questions, like yeses and nos, just to confirm that the nominee does meet your eligibility criteria. And if not, we don't waste their time filling out nomination forms, nor do we waste your time or even the nominee's time filling out the full application when they just, quite frankly, don't meet the eligibility. So, like one very obvious example here would be like if you had five different award categories and one of them is like a 30 under 30 and the person is like 47 years old. That's not meant to be like discriminatory. It just means that they're not a fit for that particular award category. You can also go one step further and you can take the thought away from both nominator and nominee by having them answer a series of questions and then leveraging a tool like Reviewer to actually sort them into whatever award category they best align with, right? So like you can go really complex with this. And what's happening is we're building a persona about the nominee. And then based off of that persona, we're actually kind of putting them where we think that they belong. So it helps kind of bring awareness and help create opportunity for those people who may have previously not applied or don't really know where they fit. So from there, we get into the form. So again, super simple, super low barrier. This is who I am. This is who I'm nominating, and this is why. And that's really about it, right? The goal here is not to create a bunch of content that we're going to use for review and selection. Although you might use those high-level paragraphs on why they're being nominated, the number one goal here is to increase participation. So as soon as this gets submitted, all of my nominees in theory could get an email notification in real time. And that would say something like, hey, you've been nominated for this year's, 30 under 30 category. Click here to start. Some of you also may not do that in real time. You may let all the nominations come in, vet through them first, kind of take a quick peek, figure out like who you want to actually invite, and then you can trigger that notification to go out later on. I think many of us have like this private connotation around our programs where we want to surprise our nominees at our galas. And in theory, that sounds great. In more practicality, though, most nominators are actually working with the nominee to get the information from them. So it really isn't a surprise. So if we know that, why don't we just get the data directly from the source? So once the nominee is notified, this is where they create their profile. And again, this is where I would strongly recommend using things like single sign-on with your AMS. But the concept of a profile is absolutely pivotal. No matter what you walk away with today, this workflow is one that I would highly recommend implementing. And then number two is try to incorporate some type of concept of a profile. There are so many moving parts to an award. You've got nominations, you've got applications, you've got file uploads, you've got communication, you've got like some type of review and selection scoring process. And then maybe you want to collect bios from your nominees to be used in press releases. It could be photos or headshots, whatever it could be. So how do you systematically take all of these moving parts and put them into one place? And that's why the profile becomes very important. So in this case, the nominee starts their profile. Again, if you do have those eligibility questions, I would highly recommend loading those into the system. This is a pretty simple award category or a submission form. And I think that's okay. Just kind of keeping in mind that like whatever you can dream up, we can do. We've got some awards that have, 15 pages, lots of file uploads. Some are just 6 questions. But the idea is that they kind of self-select these eligibility criterias and they start to enter the information about themselves. So here's who I am as a nominee. Here's my mission, passion, and vision for your career. Here's the activities that I participate in. Again, all of this content is going to be hyper unique to your own particular association and your award categories. This is just an example. But you can kind of put yourself in these shoes. This is a Chamber of Commerce using a reviewer for their recognition awards, and you can't ask a nominator to answer these questions, such as, have you actively participated in the business community? They don't know. And if they do, they're just going to say yes, right? That's not a compelling enough narrative to help us go through review and selection. So our quality of content is going to be dramatically increased here. Things like file uploads are going to be collected, references. I am going to pause there. Another quick show of hands. Does anybody incorporate like letters of recommendation or support to your program? And I'll just wait for a quick second to see if anybody raises their hand on this. Okay, a couple just popped up right away. Yep, three. Yep. So becoming very common. So this is traditionally speaking very, very common with scholarships, and it's becoming very common now within an award. So the general premise here, and I want to take a step back, the number one goal is to lower the barrier for the submitter, but then also how do we create like a picture of who they are that differentiates themselves versus other candidates or other nominees. And so I'm a huge advocate of like essay prompts and personal storytelling, but I'm also a huge advocate of references, right? Let's let a third party individual also contribute to this. Now, the downside to that is how do you collect those references? Generally, they don't want to go through the hands of the submitter because it's private. However, you guys specifically do not want them to send them to you via email, right? Because then you're trying to figure out like who is this person, who does it belong to, how do I connect it back together? If you do any data redaction, it becomes very, very hard. The other piece to that is I really hate letters of recommendation. Letters are being asked to be written at the very last minute. They're very complex to write. You're asking somebody to sit down from scratch and write a full-on letter. Their effort and energy starts to decline. And then, quite frankly, it becomes a reflection of their writing ability, not necessarily who it's about. So you might have really strong nominees that just have poorly written references and then they get penalized because of it. So to combat that, what you can do is you can have the nominee put in like the name and email of the reference and then trigger a notification to go to them. So it might say like, hey, Susie, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Kyle for this year's 30 under 30. Click here to do so. And generally speaking as well, like those references will come from like coworkers or peers at their organization, or it could be like a character request. And then it brings them directly into a reference portal. So the major differentiation here is that it lowers the barrier for the references. They're not sitting from scratch writing letters trying to figure out how to submit it to you. They just click on a link and then answer the questions as they appear. In this particular model, though, this is a very drastic shift from a letter. We're asking them to rank the nominee on a series of 5 qualities. So these are like the pillars that we're looking for that particular awardee. And then also like what are 3 very, very short, like 200 word essay prompts. So it kind of mimics the style of a letter, but it's, instead of writing from scratch, it's more of like a guided experience. Now, the beauty of this is that once it submits, it gets automatically assigned back to the profile. So now we have the nominator, the nominee, the application, the files, and the references all in real time compiled for you guys. So yeah, I'm going to come back to that. I do want to pause there. If you guys have any questions, comments that you want to talk about on the profile concept or how we structure that dual nominator nominee workflow, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I do want to kind of visualize one other thing though. So I've used the term profile quite a bit. My goal today is not to get too deep into like operational stuff. We've done many webinars on that. I want to focus more heavily on the review and selection as well as like the peer voting because I think it's a really cool component to incorporate. But I do want to kind of show you that all of our clients do get these command centers. And this is like your one-stop shop for really all program management. So dates and deadlines, recent activities, and then like where are people? So for me, it's really powerful. So to increase your participation rates, the nominator nominee workflow is number one. And then number two is that humans will always procrastinate. So this allows you guys to in real time see like how many people have started nominations, if they're done or not done. If they're not done, you can send reminders, you can automate it. It also allows you to see how many people were nominated. Have they then submitted their application? If not, you can send them reminders and or send reminders to the nominator. And then we can kind of go to the end of the spectrum and look at those references. How many outstanding references were requested? Do you want to send them reminders or not as well? Um, I want to go show you those profiles. So in a very traditional award structure, and I don't mean to offend anybody, if you're using like built-in web forms, Jot forms, SurveyMonkey, Cognito forms, fill in the blank, or your AMS, what often happens is that now you have to go to those tools. You get like a virtual spreadsheet concept, right? Where you have like one row per nominee, and then you have a bunch of columns, and that's all the data associated with them. So, in order to actually take action on your submissions and more importantly, share those out to the review team, there is a considerable amount of downloading of documents, recompiling, building out these like virtual nomination packets. In Reviewer, you guys get this very simple menu, and you can sort and filter by all of the different awards in different categories, by submission status. And then once you click into somebody's profile, you can start to visualize it. So in this example, I have Ryan. Ryan is one of my nominees. And in the center of my page is all of the content we've collected from he or she. So this is their eligibility requirements, their personal information. There's those short form essays. Right? Again, this will directly mimic your nomination forms. At any time, I can do messaging. So I can do bulk outbound emails to individuals, groups of people. I can send them direct messages in the app itself. So maybe like Ryan is an award recipient, and now I want he or she to come back and upload a headshot, then fill out like a 200 character bio to be used on your website. You can log notes about them. So if you want to kind of collaborate with your internal staff and team, you actually log it directly on the nomination packet, not on like emails or forms. All of those file uploads show up in your attachment section. So files are going to be hyper unique to you guys as programs. It could be your references, resumes. But again, I've seen some programs that collect like 10 different documents. It could be like compliance elements. It could be certifications, whatever it might be. It could be links, right, to like media that they've been published in. Again, the opportunities are endless. With that said, I hate to see you guys have to download and export anything. I want to keep you guys in a dedicated tool. So when you press view, it actually then embeds the file directly in front of us. Now, this is quite an ugly example. It's a spreadsheet, but this could be a video and you could watch the video right in the system. It could be a photo, it could be a PowerPoint, it could be a PDF. But again, I can kind of visualize all the documents in one place. Similar concept with those references. So in this particular example, this could be both references or it could be the nominations. So maybe Frederick is the one that nominated Ryan, and then Luis is the one that wrote the reference. It shows you that information here, and then when you press view, it actually embeds what was said about them. So this is where you would see like what the nominator said about the nominee as well as what the reference added about them. So hopefully this helps you guys visualize like the power of a profile, which does segment into the next piece here, which is like the review and selection workflows, because we really need to avoid thinking through our programs as data, right? You have volunteer review committees that have to review content, but at the end of the day, these are people or their chapters or their members, and we want to treat them as such. So instead of trying to figure out like what do we share with our volunteers for judging and scoring, what we're really doing is we're sharing the entire nomination packet that was compiled for you guys automatically in real time. So some of the things I want to look at with the review and selection, I'm going to do kind of two things here. One of which is going to be your formal like committee-based review and selection, which I'm a huge advocate of. And then two is I want to look at how do you start to tie in your broader membership and give them a voice. And I don't know how many of you guys do member voting. If you guys want to leave another like reaction or emoji, I'm kind of interested as well. So one of the biggest challenges that we see on the review side is, again, they are volunteers, or they have other obligations that they're trying to fulfill. And so to ask them to go to tools like Google Drive or ship them off a bunch of spreadsheets, telling them to review that information, log it in spreadsheets, is going to overwhelm them. It's going to burn them out. They're less likely to be volunteers in the future, and the quality of the review starts to go down significantly. I personally have two small children, and so if I'm part of your review committee, I'm certainly doing this on my iPads at 10:30 at night on a Wednesday. So in that model, you have to lower the barrier for me. What we've also found, there's two more things I want to look at here, is what the max workload looks like. So it's very dependent on the complexity of your nomination forms and your scoring criteria, but most volunteers hit a threshold at about 30 nominations. If you give them, say, for example, 52 nominations to review, they will not score 52 on the same scale as they gave number one, even though it's the same scorecard. So if we know these things, like how do we start to evenly distribute the workflows, create committees, create what I call buckets to kind of share that out? The other thing I want to look at here is also score normalization. So this is going to become very important here in just a moment because I'm a huge advocate of random review. So taking your submissions and equally and randomly shared amongst your staff. But what happens if you've got some committee members who are just quite frankly hard asses and they score on a completely different scale than somebody else? How do you not penalize a nominee that was scored by somebody who historically is a more tough judge? So let's kind of take a look at that. So kind of two quick questions came in. I am going to address them as we go. How do you balance the desires of volunteers and board members who are involved in the process? And what's realistic and doable for the actual association staff? For that question, I'm going to kind of save that to come back later. What ends up happening though is a lot of people want to be involved. They want to offer their feedback and insights, and then nothing actually gets done, right? It's like the old too many hands in the cookie jar. I mean, the team should trust you guys as staff, as the owners and stakeholders to this program. I like to assign like a chair, right? And I know many of you guys have committee chairs, but figure out like who from your board and who from your volunteer committees each and every year you want their input on. They can kind of work collectively amongst themselves to kind of give you thoughts and feedback, but they serve as like your main point of contact. That way the communication doesn't get messy. Another kind of question came in on can the nominator see the nominee responses and can the nominee see the references submitted? The answer to that question is yeses and nos in both, right? It's up to you. I would say very, very rarely do we see the nominee themselves see what was said about them. There is another model here you could consider where you can have the nominator submit the bulk of the content, and then the nominee, instead of submitting their own application, basically reviews, refines, and adds to it. So in that model, you might. You could also make it anonymous. I almost never see, though, reference information being shared with the nominee. They can see if the reference submitted or not for their own follow-up purposes, but the actual content itself doesn't get shared. I'm a big advocate of in this dual nominator nominee workflow to focus the bulk of your review and selection on what the applicant said, because again, it kind of evens the playing field where, I might not be a good writer as a nominator, but I do know that, Tony is a really good fit. So why don't we just make sure we compare apples to apples where all the content that's being scored is from what the applicant said about themselves. But to answer your question, it's very much up to you. We support all of those different models. And we can kind of look at that here right now. So as I kind of go there, the other thing I want to kind of just highly quickly introduce is member choice awards. So at its core, the number one, I guess, review process should be from your committees, your teams, and your volunteers. I'm also a big advocate of having like broad distribution of volunteers. And so when you go to have like a dedicated review committee, like you can't have too many people helping you guys do reviews. It should be your board and your executive team. It should be your staff and stakeholders, but also consider leveraging prior year award recipients and letting them serve on the review committee as well. You get kind of a different, unique perspective targeting these different types of demographics. With that said, the number one challenge with an award program is the only people that get engaged are nominators, nominees, and your internal staff. And unless you have every single member get nominated, a large percentage of your membership does not partake in the program. They might come to the gala, they might check the newsletter, but they're not actually actively involved. So if we know that and we want to engage everybody, the number one thing that you guys can consider doing is having a member voting mechanism. Now, by no means is that your selection criteria, right? Like we don't want to put all of the review on the members. What I would do is I would carve out a second award recipient, and they call it member choice. So you might have two 30 under 30 recipients this year. One that's like, voted upon by your team and your staff. It goes through a formal judging and scoring process, and then a member's choice award recipient. The other reason why I really like that is every single person that goes to that page and casts a vote is also going to be more likely next year to either submit a nomination or self-apply themselves, right? Because everybody wants to be nominated and visualized by their peers. So let's look at both of these components. So this is one of the more powerful features in Reviewer. Again, my goal here is not necessarily to demo Reviewer. I want to visualize how you guys can do this. So what I would do is I would create what I call buckets for your review process. If you offer multiple award categories, I would have one bucket per award category, and that's kind of what you can visualize here. So I've got 20 under 40, new member of the year, volunteer of the year, future educator, whatever it might be. And so what happens here is when people submit nominations, at least with our system, it'll identify what category that they belong to, and then it drops them into a bucket. If you have for one award or if you have a lot of volume, you can create segments within here. So you might have like 20 under 40, phase one, phase two, phase three, right? But the general idea behind this bucketing system is you take a bucket and you fill it up with two parties. One is your nominees and the other is your review team. So if your goal is to try to like share the workload, you might consider having dedicated review pods or teams or committees on a per award basis. So in this example, when Sally, Sue, and Steve come in to review, they only look at 20 under 40. When Cindy, Tony, and Paul come in, they only look at the new member of the year. You could also say, hey, in phase one, I want our internal team of like 3 to 5 people just to do a quick thumbs up, thumbs down. Let's narrow it down. And then phase two might have a dedicated judging panel from your executive teams or from your boards or from your volunteers, right? So there's many ways to set this up. But what I'm trying to visualize here is we know for a fact that we don't want them to look at more than 30 nominations. The lowest hanging way to solve that is to kind of create little mini committees and pods. What you could also do, though, is you can open these buckets up, and this is one of the features that I really try to push people on, and do random pairing. So what you could basically say is, hey, here's a listing of all of my nominees. I also have here a list of all of my potential volunteers. And what you can do is you can bulk select and say, hey, I want every nominee to get looked at 5 times, no more, no less. Or you could say, hey, I want my volunteers to look at somewhere between 20 to 25 submissions. And then within reviewer, the system will then equally and randomly take your nominations and then share it out based off of that math. Now, if there's conflicts of interest, they can kind of self-report in the review process. You can reassign them. So if I want to get hyper specific here, I could say, hey, Mark has a conflict of interest with Gabrielle. I can now just unselect her name. So I know I ran through that pretty quickly, but again, what I'm trying to visualize here is in a perfect world, I understand that the world's not perfect and far from it. I don't want your review team looking at every single nominations, right? They all start to look very similar, and it's very hard for them to justify results. So create buckets, create segments, differentiate them, and then try to leverage randomization. Now, what does the review itself look like? Again, these are volunteers, so we have to make sure that like there's no more than 2 clicks, right? So when our volunteers come in to conduct a selection, they get a very simple menu, which is a list of the nominees that they're in charge of reviewing. Again, if you want to redact any personal identifying information, you certainly can. But the general idea here is that your team just simply clicks on the nominee and they get a split screen and they're both independent. So I have the nomination packet on one end. And again, you guys are not compiling these packets. The system is doing this for you automatically in real time, and you get to choose specifically what shows up for them. So you can kind of see here, I have all of the information about the nominee, Ryan. Here's their personal information. There's their essay prompts. Off to the right, I've got my selection tool. Selection tools in review are 100% customizable. So whatever like metrics you want your team to review on, you certainly can. As you can see here, though, as a judge or a committee member, I am not giving them points. Let me rephrase that. I'm not scoring them on a scale from like 0 to 20. Many associations will do things like that, but the problem is that your volunteers get really bogged down in numbers. Like, how do you differentiate a 16 versus a 17? And it seems like a very small thing, but when you start to run averages in that scale, those numbers really do influence the results. So, in order for you to do 2 things, one, speed up the review, and then two, get higher quality reviews, flip it and instead ask them to offer an emotional response. So in this particular example, like demonstrate a strong drive for growth and improvement. Instead of saying on a scale from 1 to 15, I say from not applicable or somewhat applicable to exceeds expectations. The emotional response from a judge is always higher quality. Now, behind the scenes at the bottom, you can see that there are point values. And so obviously these answers do tabulate and you can still get like quantitative leaderboards based off of it. Again, though, with the whole side-by-side view here, I as a volunteer can fill out my scores. I can look at file uploads. Those do embed themselves side by side. I can leave comments. I can leave notes. I can look at those references. And then once I'm done reviewing this particular nominee, I just simply submit and I move on to the next. So right now, the average hourly rate for a volunteer is $34.79. Most organizations do not look at it from a dollar perspective. They just think that these are volunteers, but there is a national guideline of what a volunteer hour is worth. If you had 100 submissions and you ask a volunteer to review 100 of them, they're going to spend roughly $861, right? And that's not a made up number, like that's real true dollars and math. And so, how do we cut that by 4x? And it's by doing tools like this. Now, to visualize these results, you guys basically get these leaderboards. So, at any stage, you can kind of jump in here and filter by your award. So, I can say, hey, show me the 30 under 30 category. It shows me a listing of every nominee. It'll show me who from your team scored them and then how they scored, either individually, collectively, totals, and averages. And we don't make decisions for you. We just give you all the data that you guys need to make selections. So what generally happens is that you have a cutoff line. Maybe it's like the top 10. And then at the bottom, you move them to a phase two review. Or maybe this gets pulled up by the committee chair and they deliberate. There might be a really compelling case why Sheldon should be selected. So before I show you the last thing, which is that peer voting or the member voting, I do want to offer one quick insight. So I mentioned before that I love random review, right? Randomly assigning nominations to your committees. The downside is that not every not every volunteer looks at the same submissions. So if you look at these data on the right, Mark scored Sheldon at 12. That's quite low in comparison to Judge Judy. So red flags start to go off. Did Mark just score Sheldon low because it was a poor quality entrant? Or like, what if historically speaking, Mark has never given higher than a 15? By his or her own standards, they scored Sheldon very, very well, but they're being penalized against their peers. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. We do have a really cool report though. I'm going to just show you here visually what it looks like called normalization. And what this basically does is it shows you judging tendencies by your committee. So it shows you how each one of them scores on average. So looking at the data, Judge Judy on average gives about a 24, but Tony gives about a 34. So right there in itself, if I was a nominee scored by Judge Judy, I'm going to be penalized. So this system helps you guys identify that. You can kind of coach them, train them, elevate their expectations so it's more in alignment. Or you say, hey, I value you as a volunteer, so I really don't care. In this example, a 24 and a 34 are the same, right? It's average. It's 100% that individual judge's average. And now that we know that, we can start to compare judging averages to one another. So you get like a new scorecard that basically would say, hey, here's your results and how they scored on average compared to one another. So I won't get too much deeper into that for the sake of time, but it is kind of an eye-opening report that many of our clients like to look at. Okay, so peer review. So I talked a lot about member voting, right? It's a way for you guys to literally incorporate your entire membership and give them a voice. With that said, there's another use case which is much lower barrier, and it's celebration. How many of you, show of hands, right now on your websites have a list of prior year award recipients, but that list is basically by year, by award, and then just their name. In this model, we can kind of really visually take it to the next level. So this is what I call a showcase page. And you guys can dynamically send nominees. You could send award recipients to this page. And so without public voting, you could basically say, hey, show me all of the 25, 30 under 30 recipients. And then you get this kind of grid and it'll dynamically pull in an image. So again, this might be where you have, in this case, like Ryan come back into reviewer, upload a headshot, and then you ask them to submit like a Twitter length description of his or her achievements. So you get an image, who they are, a brief description, and then when you open up their profiles, you get an image gallery if you desire, or it could just be their headshot, and then off to the right is their bio. So this whole right side here is completely custom. Your nomination form might be, I'm going to make up a really high number, like 150 questions, right? You don't want all that information to show up here. You want to know who Ryan is, why they were nominated, and then like why they were selected. So you keep this nice, short, and condensed. But visually speaking, instead of me going to a list of names over the last 15 years, I can then click into their name and actually learn more about like who they were as a member and kind of celebrate them. For those of you that do want to incorporate member voting, there is a voting mechanism that's enabled here. Generally, you want some type of like login to cast a vote. The reason why I say that is we don't want them to game the system by buying votes or clearing their session. I know it sounds awful and sad, but it does happen quite often. So maybe like single sign on with their AMS, they can read Ryan's bio, and if they want to cast a vote, they simply cast a vote. And then again, from a reporting perspective, you now have two separate parallel winners. I don't know if I like that term or not. You have all of the award recipients from your committee voting, all of your recipients from the member voting, and then at your galas you in advance can kind of share some of this information, or that's where you surprise the member voting there in person. So I'm gonna again share this all out later on. Again, for the sake of time, one thing I do want to kind of just address here is the year-round recognition process. Obviously, depending on your demographic, if you guys watch the Hunger Games movie, right, they have the concept of like a tribute, right, and they kind of parade them around to all these different places. I like that model for member recognition. So you guys now have these really powerful stories. You also have these members who are doing incredible things. They can offer insights and feedback to your membership. So, digital showcasing of who they are, have them be guest speakers at conferences, put them on a podcast, put them on a webinar, have them ghost write newsletters for you guys, right? Connect them to younger members as mentorship. The idea is to try to incorporate the nomination process and the celebration process into all of your other member engagement initiatives, right? That way it stays top of mind. So with all that said, I am going to pause. I know I went a little long here, but I do want to open it up for a Q&A to address anything. And it doesn't have to be about today's topic. The beautiful part about what we do here at Reviewer is we're very fortunate to work with, thousands of membership-based associations. You guys are not alone. A lot of the challenges that impact you guys also face one another. And so hopefully I have some insights and feedback that I can share. If not, we certainly have the resources here to help align you guys. So I'm going to mute myself, take a sip of water, and any questions, comments at all about the platform, about the topic, or anything in general, toss them in there, and we'll just hang out until no questions come in.